Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Noah Khogali back to the program. Noah, this isn't your first time on Moving Forward with Young Voices, but for those who are meeting you for the very first time, take a moment and tell us just a little bit about yourself and what you do.
So obviously I'm a commentator with Young Voices. I moonlight as a local government councillor as well, which is, gives me a good insight into what's really, on the minds of normal people. And then I also work for a member of the Shadow Cabinet up here in Scotland as well. So a good breadth of stuff in UK politics. Well, it's interesting.
I'm looking at an article you've written, and the headline is very captivating, and I can't wait to dive into this in detail. We can't wean politicians off the NIMBYs, so we must get them on board with housing. And I'll admit, I thought that Not in My Backyard was strictly an American phenomenon. Apparently it's not.
See, I thought it was very much a UK phenomenon. I'm quite surprised to hear it's a big thing for you guys too. It's something that I think is an eternal frustration in UK politics, that everybody, I think, identifies that we've got a problem over here with housing supply. But everybody seems to be on the same mind that if a party tries to go and solve it, they're probably not going to win an election. And they're going to upset all, those old people that own houses already, they're all fine. But they're also the ones that vote, and they're the ones that really drive the political agenda. So it's a real challenge over here.
So Noah, help me understand what kind of a housing shortage are you dealing with in the UK?
So realistically, the UK needs hundreds of thousands more homes. Young people broadly seem to have essentially given up on ever really owning a home. House prices have gone up and up and up, as I think they probably have in the US since the end of the last century. And house ownership is down across the board, especially for people under 35. And the reality is the government aren't hitting their targets either. So the UK government have a target of 300,000 homes a year, which when immigration alone is above that, that's not enough. But they're not even hitting that. We have an incredibly constricting planning regime across the country. So that's in Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland. It's incredibly restrictive. It's hard to build homes, but that means that the prices stay high and the vested interests are all kept very happy.
Yeah, well, you preemptively answered one of the big questions that I had, and that's why is it so hard? You would think that the market would be able to, provide homes if the demand is there. But talk to me about the regulatory situation when a person wants to build a home. Help me understand, how difficult is it to work your way through all that's required?
So you have to jump through a lot of hoops, not least affordable housing developer contributions. So if you're building homes, the council will turn around to you and say, look, if you're going to do this, you have to create these extra homes that aren't generally as valuable as the rest of them, and just impose these small bricks that alone people aren't going to be too fussed about. But as a whole, you're looking at some quite notable increases in costs. Just recently, the Home Builders Federation have said that extra taxes and more regulation is adding about £4.5 billion onto developer costs every year. That's not an insignificant amount of money. And if we want to really ease this housing crisis, something's going to have to change. Lots of people have fear-mongered in the UK for a long time about us running out of space, and this idea about the green belt, especially around London, that in reality is not a green belt. It is essentially just oddly protected areas, lots of which, if you see pictures of them, are essentially very overgrown random bits of concrete that nobody's allowed to build a home on. And we have a serious problem in this country where discourse for the past few decades really has created these misconceptions in people's heads around house building and what the real challenges are and what the fake challenges are. And the fake challenges, like running out of space, which is complete nonsense, seem to do much better electorally. So that's what all the major parties have stuck with. But there's a real opportunity for change here.
And let's talk a moment about the NIMBY faction. Obviously, if you have a place of your own, if you have your home, I've got mine. I don't want to see that spoiled. I really don't want to see high density housing, or I don't want to see a lot of the neighborhood becoming more crowded. How much political power do groups like this have?
A lot, and one of the metrics that is often used for analysing how a country is doing is the house prices. And when house prices start to come down, people really freak out as if that's some terrible thing. And the reality is that people of my generation, especially, and people that aren't on the housing ladder yet, or might never be, look at that and go, well, that actually just makes housing more accessible. It's a very simple supply and demand issue. And again, because that's become, looking at housing prices has become such an integral part of economic analysis in this country. And I think in the US too, it's a pretty broad phenomenon. It's again created this misconception that if house prices are coming down, that's inherently a bad thing. And look, when house prices have gone up so much, I understand people wanting to protect their investment. But the reality is that, we've all got to do some tough things. We've got to make some sacrifices because or else these younger generations are in a lot of trouble.
Oh, absolutely. And yeah, and I won't say I'm glad to see that that's the case elsewhere, but it's also kind of comforting to see, okay, that's not strictly an American phenomenon. It's happening everywhere. You would think that would provide some good incentive for leaders, in every country and at every level to be a little more flexible in helping to provide solutions. Is there any chance of the regulatory burden being lessened in the UK?
I mean, realistically, it's probably unlikely. So lots of that regulatory burden has essentially come out of the net zero project, whilst in its own right, the net zero project, completely commendable and trying to be climate aware, fine. But the reality is that's made homes much more expensive to build. And we have to find a balance then between the regulatory burdens that we're putting on developers and then also taxing them. And we have to find a balance where we're not just expecting the developers to shoulder all of the cost, and the government needs to start easing taxes on them as well, so that their costs don't just go up and up and up, and provide more incentive to build more in the UK. That's the only way out of this. We've seen this in Scotland, that there's potentially any gas heating, gas boilers are going to be banned by 2030 in new homes. That kind of thing is going to be expensive. Something like heat pumps aren't cheap. So there is a challenge there coming down the road where it looks like more regulation is going to get thrust onto these developers, and there's going to be no real tax break to come along with it. So you might just start seeing them pull out of the market, and that really would be a calamitous situation for everybody.
Noah, talk to me about the divide between rural versus urban thinking. Do the populations in rural areas approach the housing situation differently than their urban counterparts?
So I think their arguments are different. And look, I live in a very rural area, and the argument that gets put to me a lot as a local councillor, and I don't sit on planning committee myself, but people will still come to me with their concerns. And the concerns that people come with are often based around infrastructure and the suggestion that we don't have enough space in our schools, we don't have enough space in our GP practices, it's going to clog up the roads, there's not enough parking, all of these things, lots of which are actually solved. So there's a frustration from me, who has access to all of the data, that we've actually got plenty of room in most schools across the country. There is room. But people use it, especially in rural areas, as a cover for the fact that they just don't want more homes. And I think people have to start being honest about what their concern is. If you don't want more homes, you have to be able to justify that with actual statistics. You can't just be making up nonsense arguments that are quite easily disproven.
Is it selfishness that's at the root of that? Not wanting to share that space, or is there some wisdom behind, hey, let's keep a little separation between us and the neighbors?
I think it is almost entirely selfishness. Not wanting, houses right next to you. I understand that there's a privacy element, but it is perfectly possible to create absolutely, beautiful communities where you have got, you're building up. You don't just have to build sideways. And you look at somewhere like Bath or Bristol, and it is living proof, or even Edinburgh, and it is living proof that you can build up 3, 4, 5 stories and have 3, 4, or 5 homes there. We don't just have to go outwards. We can. There is other dimensions.
Okay, and last but not least, you mentioned that this is about weaning politicians off of that NIMBY mindset. Obviously, these younger voters, the ones who are struggling to afford homes and to find housing, they're becoming quite a voter bloc, and I assume their numbers are only growing. Is that likely to cause some shift in the thinking?
In the long term, I hope so. But until we have some younger leaders who have really experienced it, I'm not sure whether it will. So at the moment, essentially, the only loud young voices in the UK are on either the far left or the far right, and they're never really going to be in power. So it's not particularly helpful. We need the Conservatives over time to go for younger and younger leaders, which they've done quite a good job at. And Labour need to do the same. So you've got people that have experienced these issues and understand how daunting it is. Because at the moment, it seems like there's a lot of lip service and not much actual action.
Okay, again, we are talking with Noah Khogali. He is a Young Voices contributor and policy director for the Conservative Friends of the Commonwealth. Noah, for people that would like to follow your writing or follow you on social media, where can they find you?
So my Twitter is probably the best place. That's at Noah Khogali on Twitter, and you'll get all my rantings there.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. I am very happy to welcome April Liu back to the program. This is not her first time on the show, but April, for those who are meeting you for the first time, maybe take just a moment here and tell us about yourself.
All right. Thank you for having me, Brian. I'm so excited to be here again. So currently I'm working as a research associate at Libertas Institute. Normally you'll catch me writing about tech policy, AI policy, anything tech related. I'm your person. This time I wrote an article that's sort of more personal to me regarding foreign students being sort of, gatekept and locked out of the workforce by bureaucracy and all that. And I came up with some policy recommendations, so I'm really excited to speak about it today.
Well, first of all, I've got to say, if you are affiliated with Libertas, you have my attention and you have my respect. I really think a lot of the work that Connor and his team are doing there. Talk to me about the red tape. You start your article with the words U.S. citizens only. What does that mean for an international student who's looking for work?
Right. So what does it mean? It means that we're probably not going to get the job. Normally, this happens when we're applying for jobs that perhaps are not e-verified if you're under OPT STEM, because that's a requirement, or a job that simply doesn't want to go through all the alleged paperwork and bureaucracy and all those steps that they have to follow in order to hire international students. This is obviously, these words are usually a huge letdown because we put in a tremendous amount of time and energy into, as everyone else does, tailoring our resumes, tailoring our cover letters, and going through interview rounds, only to be told, the company only hires U.S. citizens.
So I have to ask, what's the reasoning behind that hesitancy to hire anything other than U.S. citizens? Is this about protecting U.S. jobs, or is there something more behind that?
For sure. Sometimes, I'm sure sometimes, and rightfully so, U.S. firms want to protect U.S. jobs. And the nature of some jobs, for instance, government related jobs, they require you to be a U.S. citizen because, it comes at national security concerns. And sometimes U.S. citizens are just better, their skills are more favorable for certain positions. The reason why some companies may be reluctant to hire international students, though, is because there's a large misconception that hiring us is going to take away these jobs, especially in the STEM fields, which actually isn't the case. And hiring us is going to just come out with a mountain of paperwork and some compliance issues, which is also not the case.
Now, and I believe you mentioned this isn't a matter of, well, really there aren't that many jobs to fill. I hear from a number of people in different sectors of the economy that there's a real shortage of workers. So it's not like, these jobs are already taken. It sounds like it's more like we just have these barriers to entry into the labor market.
Yeah, I completely agree. And actually, international students, by many reports, we help create jobs. So there's this NAFSA report from, I believe, 2018 to 2019. It said that for every 7 international students, there were 3 jobs created in the U.S. So that added up to a total of around like 450K.
Wow. That's okay. So obviously the need is there, but it sounds like the path forward is not as clearly marked. What needs to happen in order to keep these students from being locked out of the workforce?
So I think that there should be a start with better educating all of the hiring staff, making sure that they actually know what OPT entails. For instance, OPT versus OPT STEM are two completely different things. A lot of employers don't like OPT STEM because it requires them to be E-verified, but normal OPT, on the other hand, has no requirements. It's all on the student's ends. We're the ones who have to fill out the paperwork. We're the ones who pay, $410 for a filing fee. We don't add any additional costs in terms of hiring on the company's end. And I think that it wouldn't be too hard for the government to sort of implement these, education workshops, for instance. So I talk in my article about the Environmental Protection Agency, which, they provide workshops for companies on how to handle different waste. And I think that certain U.S. immigration agencies could also do something similar for U.S. employers. Another step, I think, is companies should clearly disclose in their job posts whether or not they accept OPT students or whether or not they accept just international students in general. It would save both the student and the company a lot of time and energy in the application process. And yeah.
And how does STEM figure into this too? You had mentioned that particularly in STEM areas, there's hesitation. Why would there be hesitation on the part of the bureaucracy to incorporate more international students in those areas?
So I think it's more of a firm issue. So currently, if your school designates a certain program or certain major as STEM, then it's assumed that the employer would also, align itself with whatever your school says. But a lot of employers, because OPT STEM it's got like this stigma, it's got this sort of, they're reluctant to not comply with the law properly. For instance, for me, I applied for a position for econ, and the employer felt like econ wasn't STEM, but at my school it is. So I feel like there's a lack of communication and, sort of like an information asymmetry situation here.
Okay. And you had mentioned that sometimes the definitions of STEM kind of get stretched a little bit beyond, I think, what people would normally think, including in some cases, social sciences and economics.
Yes, exactly. So nowadays, STEM isn't just traditional sciences anymore, like math. It can also encompass social sciences like politics, economics, and sociology.
Nice. So, April, we've got about a minute or so left here. Let's talk about, again, what needs to happen and where does it need to happen? I mean, obviously, there are a lot of federal guidelines. Is there anything that can happen at a lower level of government that can fix this, or does this have to be addressed by those federal regulatory agencies?
I think that it needs to be addressed by federal agencies because it is such a big issue. It has gone unaddressed for such a long time, and companies need to start taking it seriously. Not just companies, but also government agencies as well. And I hope that they can come up with an efficient, more streamlined process.
Okay. Again, we're talking with April Liu, and she is a Young Voices contributor, as well as, did you say you are an intern for Libertas Institute?
I'm a research associate.
A research, assistant. Tell us where we can find your writing, where we can follow you on social media for those who would like to see more of your work.
So I've got a LinkedIn. You can find me at April Liu.
Okay, and your last name spelled Liu.
Yes.
Okay, very good. Well, I wish you the best of luck. I mean, I don't know what your plans are in the future, but it would be nice to think that, your time spent here is hopefully opening some doors and not too much red tape is going to be standing in your way moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bryan.
Okay, thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Hey, I'm very happy to welcome Young Voices contributor Jack Salmon back to the program. Jack, for those meeting you for the very first time, take a moment, tell us about who you are and what you do.
Sure. Well, first, thanks for having me back on, Bryan. It's great to be back here. This is my first time back this year. I'm the Director of Policy Research at the Philanthropy Roundtable, and I work on various issues as they relate to the philanthropic sector. So we look at issues like donor privacy, donor intent, and also regulations of the sector. That's one of the issues that I'll be talking about today. So we'll delve into that some more.
Okay, yeah, I'm looking at an article that you wrote for The Hill, Federal Oversight When Regulatory Burdens Rise, Charities Suffer. And this is a bigger deal, I think, than a lot of people might understand. Jack, in my experience, a lot of people support charities. They believe it's a good idea, but they really don't have a clear understanding of how the nonprofit world works. So let's talk a little bit about some of the regulatory burdens that charities face that can actually hinder their ability to do good, where people are trying to direct, revenue or trying to direct funding in a specific cause.
Right. Well, that's something that I pointed out in my piece. In my opening of the piece, I pointed out the fact that the current administration, particularly at the federal level, is pursuing much more stringent regulatory sort of environment than prior administrations. The federal regulatory code is now somewhere close to 190,000 pages. Ooh. So that gives you some idea of the extent of, just how many rules and regulations businesses are required to follow. And we know about the economic effects on businesses of regulations, but what we don't know about, which is what I pointed out in the piece, is the impact of regulatory accumulation on the charitable sector specifically. Now, the charitable sector is very significant. It's often overlooked in the grander scheme of things, but we're talking about 6% of the economy. Donors and philanthropists every year give almost $500 billion to various causes, to various organizations working towards their charitable missions. And this is why I wrote this article in The Hill, to try and highlight the impacts of over-regulation on charitable activity at the state level.
So let's talk about what some of that regulation looks like, just so people can understand. When we talk about at the state level regulation, what are some of the hoops that these charities have to jump through in order to be able to operate as a charity, for instance?
So there's many sort of regulatory burdens and hurdles that charities have to jump through at the state level. The study that I cited was one that was published here at the Philanthropy Roundtable earlier this year by economist Wayne Weingarten. And he uses various measures to sort of weigh up the regulatory costs that are imposed on charities. So some of the things he looked at were startup costs, annual filing requirements, audit requirements, and also additional oversight regulations. To give some examples, some states have no annual filing fees, so they don't need to pay large fees every year when they're filing. Whereas states such as New York, charities there are subject to annual filing fees in excess of $1,500. Doesn't sound like a large sum of money, but for a small charity, that's quite significant. At the same time, many of these charities at the state level have annual audit requirements. Now, audits can cost anywhere up to about $20,000. That's a significant cost for small charities, particularly when the threshold for meeting that audit requirement is quite low. In some states, it's only $250,000. So you could be spending as much as 8-9% of your entire charitable fund just on the audit fees. And so it's really, these organizations that are working towards supporting communities, whether it's a food bank or whether it's a inner city school funded by business leaders and philanthropists, rather than serving those communities, they're spending so much time and so many resources on these sort of filing requirements and these regulatory requirements. Many of them are also duplicative of federal regulations. So some states actually require charities to file not only to the state AG, but then also to file the same forms to the State Department. And so they're having to do it essentially twice every year. And so it's really quite burdensome.
Yeah, I'm resisting the urge to make a note that the government takes some of these charities very literally, like as when we want to receive some of that charity. Why the high costs here? I mean, it seems like that would provide an enormous disincentive for the private sector charitable organizations to step up and be engaged in all the various causes that they're engaged in.
Yeah, it's really worrying. I suspect many of the policymakers at the state level, they have this misconception. They see charitable organizations as being synonymous with business, and so they want to apply the same sorts of regulatory burdens to those organizations. I mean, that obviously simply isn't the case. These are non-profit organizations serving communities. They're not making profits. On the other hand, there's another worrying trend that we're seeing in some states. Over the last couple of years, we've seen bills in states such as Oregon, where they introduced bills to try and require nonprofit organizations they would only allow nonprofit organizations to comply with open meeting laws, to essentially fully function as nonprofits if they had received public funds. And so there's this misconception out there that nonprofit funds are somehow synonymous with public funds, that it's public money. And again, this simply isn't the case. These are donations. People have intent in mind when they donate to these causes, when they donate to these organizations who are trying to support these communities and pursue their organizational missions. Interestingly, what the study that I cite in the piece finds is the 5 states with the most heavy regulatory burden compared to the states with the least regulatory with the lowest regulatory burden. The lower regulation states had about 30% more charities per capita than the most regulated states. And so we're seeing significantly more charitable activity. We're seeing more thriving civil society in the states that have a softer touch approach, that aren't pursuing these unnecessary regulatory burdens that accumulate over time.
Wow. I'm just only because I spent about a year working in a nonprofit, that's what really opened my eyes. And I was in development, which means I was one of the guys who was reaching out to write grants and to access, charitable organizations that exist for the purpose of disseminating, funds to worthwhile causes. I was shocked at how many different types of charities are out there operating. And, just for people who've never been exposed to that, you may think, well, it's the Salvation Army or it's, Goodwill or something like that. But it is such a broad spectrum of people and causes and funds that are being distributed. I think it would really surprise people. And frankly, I don't know how anybody could in good faith make the argument, oh yeah, this needs more regulation because we want to keep a tight lid on that. I think we'd want to encourage it.
I agree, and you kind of hit the nail on the head with that overview, because much of the regulatory approach is more of a one-size-fits-all approach to these organizations, and there is no one typical charitable organization. As you say, they vary in nature. They have different communities that they serve. They have different missions, but there is some hope. Some states are beginning to introduce legislation that would require any new implemented regulatory requirements to go through the legislative process first. So it adds a sort of level of oversight of those regulations, which is the opposite of what we're seeing at the federal level. This year alone, the states of Indiana and Montana have both introduced some legislation that's sort of along these lines, the Charity Protection Act. So it requires those state legislators to push those regulations through the state legislature if they want to have those new regulations imposed, rather than just imposing those costs on those charitable organizations. So those charities can actually spend less of their time and resources having to comply with regulations and spend more time advancing their missions and supporting the communities in need.
Well, and again, it has to be said, we're talking about these are charities that are using money that is voluntarily given. It's not extracted from the taxpayers under threat of, now you'll be in trouble if you don't pay this. So I would think anything that saves the taxpayers or lessens the taxpayers' burden, or for that matter, the costs of government oversight, would be something that would be welcomed. But it sounds like there are some mixed messages being sent from those regulatory policies, as well as the people and the agencies that create those policies, that government seems to want a hand in that charitable giving.
Unfortunately, that seems to be a trend that we're seeing. And again, it's this misconceived idea that charitable funds are somewhat akin to public money, which simply isn't the case. And that's a dangerous sort of perception that we need to keep at distance, because it does have bad ramifications. One of the worst, of course, would be a chilling effect in the charitable sector. And what we don't need right now is sort of less charitable activity. We're currently facing a cost of living crisis. We have inflation. And so, it's very important that we have this thriving civil society, these charitable organizations supporting communities that need it most right now.
Well said. Again, we're talking with Jack Salmon. He is a Young Voices contributor and writer on economics. And Jack, for people who wish to follow you, how can they find you? Where can they find you on social media, for instance?
You can find my details as well as my Twitter handle if you want to follow me on social media at my Young Voices bio page. And if you want to reach out to me about philanthropic issues, you can also go to my bio page at the Philanthropy Roundtable website.